Rugby darkest moments. Rugby, a game of giants built on grit, glory, and unbreakable brotherhood. But beneath the roaring crowds and thunderous tackles, there are stories the sport doesn't want you to hear. Stories of lives lost too soon, of legends who can't remember their triumphs, of corruption, betrayal, and a darkness that no final whistle could ever silence. These aren't just bad days on the pitch. These are the moments that stained the soul of the sport. This is rugby at its darkest. The tragic death of Jordan Michelet. You know, some moments in rugby aren't about the scoreline or the stadium. They're about something that hits you in the chest. And this one was different. Jordan Michelet was just 29 years old, a professional fly half playing for Rouen Normandie in the French 2nd Division. Not a superstar by global standards, but a respected player, someone who had built a solid career in French rugby. He'd just become a father. You'd think this would be the most joyful time of his life, but on January 18th, 2022, he died by suicide. Reports said he jumped from the 4th floor of a building right after crashing his car. No drugs, no alcohol, just a sudden, silent descent into darkness. And the hardest part, no one saw it coming. Not his teammates, not the club, not his family. It all unfolded in less than an hour. One moment, he was a rugby player, a new dad, a young man, with years ahead of him. The next, he was gone. What followed was pure shock. The club cancelled training, matches were postponed, and players were crying in the stands. French rugby paused, not for a celebration, not for a scandal, but because everyone was asking the same question. How did this happen? It exposed something rugby doesn't talk about enough. The mental toll, the pressure to perform, the injuries, the constant scrutiny, and then you go home and life keeps throwing things at you. People see the big tackles and tough exteriors, but they forget rugby players are human. They bleed, they break, and sometimes they don't know how to ask for help. After Jordan's death, there were calls to improve mental health support in French rugby. Some clubs started offering counselling services. The conversation grew, but it shouldn't have taken a tragedy to start it. Because in rugby, players are trained to play through pain, physical and emotional. And that mindset, while it builds resilience, can also silence cries for help. Jordan's death wasn't just a loss, it was a warning. And sadly, it wouldn't be the last time rugby would be forced to confront its human cost. Steve Thompson and dementia. You remember Steve Thompson, right? That massive hooker from England's 2003 World Cup winning team, the guy who threw the lineouts, scrummed down with the best of them and helped England lift their first and only World Cup trophy. He made history, but ask him about it now, and he'll tell you he has no memory of it, not a single moment. Steve has been diagnosed with early-onset dementia. He was just in his early 40s when it happened. Far too young for this kind of illness, and it's not just him. He's one of over 300 former players who've come forward, saying that repeated head impacts from their rugby careers have left them with serious, irreversible brain damage. We're not talking about one or two big hits. It's the constant, repeated trauma. Tackles, rucks, scrums, even just contact in training, that builds up over time. And for a long time, nobody knew the cost. Or maybe they did, but they didn't act fast enough. Thompson said something that still sticks with me. He said, "I can't remember being in Australia. I can't remember any of those games." Imagine that. You dedicate your entire life to something. You reach the highest point anyone could dream of, a World Cup final, and your brain erases all of it. Gone. And this isn't just about memory loss. We're talking about mood swings, depression, confusion, and in some cases, suicidal thoughts. Thompson's case opened the floodgates. Since then, other players have joined the lawsuit, players from England, Wales, Scotland, and even the Southern Hemisphere. All of them suffering from the same symptoms. They're suing the rugby authorities, World Rugby, the RFU, and the WRU, saying not enough was done to protect them, especially when the science around concussions and brain injuries was already there. They're not asking to kill the game, they're asking to protect the next generation. And to be fair, things are changing. We've seen stricter head injury protocols, longer recovery periods, and more research into chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, but it took far too long. And for people like Steve, the damage is already done. They played their part. They gave everything. And now, they're left watching their minds fade while the game moves on. This isn't about blaming the sport. It's about accountability and about realizing that the price of entertainment should never be someone's life or their memories. But Steve's story wasn't a one-off. The silence around player welfare, both mental and physical, has been there for years. And sometimes that silence leads to complete collapse. Now let's talk about when two historic rugby clubs just simply disappeared. But before we do that, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you. The collapse of Worcester Warriors and Wasps. If you've followed English rugby even a little bit, you know names like Worcester Warriors and Wasps aren't just ordinary clubs. They're institutions. Wasps, in particular, that's a club with over 150 years of history, multiple premiership titles, 2 Heineken Cups, and some of the most iconic players in the game's history. And Worcester, maybe not as decorated, but they had a loyal fan base, a growing setup, and a place in the premiership. They weren't just clubs, they were people's livelihoods, memories, dreams. Then, in 2022, everything fell apart. It started with whispers, unpaid wages, missed tax deadlines, late filings. People started asking questions. Were the clubs in trouble? Was it just a temporary cash flow issue? But the answers never came. And when they did, it was too late. Worcester went first. In September 2022, they were suspended from all competitions. The club was placed into administration. Players were told their contracts were terminated, not face-to-face, not in a meeting, but in emails. Just like that, careers ended. Coaching staff, medical teams, office workers, everyone was gone. Some of them didn't even get their last paycheck. One day, they were preparing for match day. The next, they were unemployed. A few weeks later, it happened again. Wasps, the 4-time English champions, the club that once beat Toulouse in a European final, filed for administration. Over 160 employees lost their jobs. No proper goodbye, no farewell game, just silence and collapse. Fans were heartbroken, players were stunned, and the Premiership lost 2 clubs mid-season. And here's the thing, this wasn't just bad luck. This was the result of poor financial management, unchecked spending, and a complete lack of transparency. Worcester's owners had debts over £25 million. Wasps, over £90 million, including a disastrous bond scheme that was meant to finance their stadium but ended up dragging the entire club under. What made it worse was how long this had been brewing. People at both clubs had raised concerns for months. There were reports, warnings, and red flags. But there was no rescue plan. The league didn't step in early enough. The RFU didn't put in safeguards. And when everything fell apart, it wasn't just the badge that suffered, it was the community around it. Local vendors, kids in the academy, families who had supported the team for generations. And what message did it send to the rest of rugby? That even the biggest clubs aren't safe. That history means nothing without proper governance. And that financial mismanagement, if ignored long enough, doesn't just ruin seasons. It erases entire legacies. Worcester Warriors are scheduled to return in the 2025 to 2026 season as part of the newly structured professional Tier 2. Wasps, too, have been granted a place in the revamped championship. So technically, the names will survive. But let's be honest, they're not coming back as the same clubs they once were. What was lost can't fully be recovered. The trust, the jobs, the momentum, those don't get restored with a fixture list. And while England was dealing with clubs collapsing under financial pressure, another crisis was erupting across the border, one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with silence, fear, and an institution's failure to protect its people. The WRU's scandal. This one wasn't about the on-pitch failure, financial collapse, or concussion protocols. This was about institutional failure, deep cultural failure, right at the top of one of the most iconic rugby unions in the world, the Welsh Rugby Union. It came to light in early 2023, but the warning signs were there long before that. A BBC Wales investigation exposed what had been festering behind closed doors, a culture where misogyny, sexism, bullying, and fear were not just present. They were allowed to grow. Women working inside the WRU described it as toxic. They weren't exaggerating. The most heartbreaking testimony came from former WRU employee Charlotte Wathen. She was a high-ranking figure, the WRU's general manager of women's rugby, not a fringe figure. She described a workplace where she was bullied, humiliated, and made to feel unsafe. At one point, she said she was physically intimidated and mocked. She spoke of an incident where a male colleague joked about her being pinned down and being called sugar tits. A moment, she said, left her physically ill. And the WRU's response? Silence, denial, inaction. Even when these complaints were raised internally, the leadership dismissed them. They issued statements claiming no wrongdoing. They minimized it. At times, they outright refused to accept there was a problem. But once the BBC documentary aired, the backlash was immediate. Public pressure mounted, sponsors began raising concerns, fans were furious, and within days, WRU CEO Steve Phillips resigned. That wasn't just a formality, it was a signal that things had reached a breaking point. It wasn't just about one man stepping down. It was about an entire institution being forced to confront how deeply it had failed to protect its people, particularly women. And here's the hard truth. This wasn't just about the WRU. This scandal exposed something uncomfortable for the entire sport. That rugby, for all its talk about values, brotherhood, and respect, still had blind spots. Still had places where accountability didn't reach, where people could abuse power, face no consequences, until the media, the fans, and the victims forced change. Following the fallout, the WRU promised reforms. They pledged independent reviews. They said the culture would be reset. But trust, that's not something you fix with a press release. It takes time, it takes action, and it takes a level of transparency that so far hasn't always been rugby's strength. What happened inside the WRU didn't involve a single tackle, pass, or try, but it was one of the darkest moments in modern rugby because it showed just how far the sport still has to go in protecting its people off the field. The tragic death of Kelly Miafwa. This one still hurts to say out loud. In May 2022, Kelly Miafwa, a 32-year-old Samoan flanker playing for Montauban in France's second division, celebrated a hard-fought win with his teammates. They'd just beaten Narbonne, 48-40. Nothing out of the ordinary. A Saturday night, some drinks, good spirits, the usual post-match relief. But hours later, in the early hours of the morning, Miafwa jumped off the Pont-Vieux bridge into the Tarn River. Emergency services recovered his body. He didn't survive. His teammate, Christopher Vautoa, tried to save him and ended up in the hospital himself. There was no foul play, no violence, no altercation, just a shocking sudden loss. and no one could make sense of it. Because from the outside, Miafua was a success story. Born in Samoa and raised in Auckland, he'd worked his way up through Australia's club rugby system and eventually signed a professional deal in France. He was powerful, fast, and a crowd favourite. One of those players who gave everything on the pitch, but no one saw what he was carrying off it. And that's the point. His death forced rugby to confront something it has largely ignored for far too long: the mental health and emotional isolation of foreign players, especially those who travel thousands of miles from home to chase a professional dream. Men from Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, and South Africa leave behind families, cultures, and languages. They come to Europe, often alone, often under pressure to perform, often carrying the expectations of an entire village back home. Miafua was one of those players. He wasn't just chasing a career. He was carrying the weight of his identity, his people, and the sacrifices that got him there. And like so many, he had to do it without the support systems that others take for granted. His suicide wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a mirror held up to the sport. Are we doing enough to check on the emotional well-being of players, especially those who don't speak the language fluently? Who doesn't have family nearby? Who might be smiling on a Saturday night, but spiraling by Sunday morning? After Miafua's death, there were statements, tributes, acknowledgements of how devastating it was. But beyond that, players began speaking more openly about depression, about loneliness, about how the locker room isn't always a safe space, about how playing in France, England, or Japan can be isolating when you're the outsider. Some called for mandatory mental health services for all foreign recruits. Others said it's time clubs take emotional care as seriously as physical rehab. Miafua didn't leave a note. We don't know what pushed him over the edge, but his story became a wake-up call. Because rugby isn't just about toughness, it's about community. And somewhere along the way, that part got lost, especially for those who give everything just to be seen. And just when the sport was grappling with that level of personal pain, a different kind of darkness bled in, this time from beyond the rugby field. A moment when racism in another sport spilled directly into rugby's heart, forcing it to ask itself where it stands on issues of race, identity, and silence. The racial abuse after Euro 2020 and rugby's reckoning. The fallout from the Euro 2020 final was supposed to be about football. England had come within inches of glory. A penalty shootout at Wembley, and then the unthinkable. Marcus Rashford, Bukayo Saka, Jadon Sancho. 3 young black men missed penalties, and almost instantly, the floodgates opened. Social media turned poisonous. Racist abuse poured in. Twitter, Instagram, comment sections, graffiti, slurs, monkey emojis. It was disgusting, and it was widespread. But what shook rugby to its core was that this wasn't just a football problem. Maro Itoje, England, rugby's towering second row, British and Irish Lions star, Cambridge-educated, a face of modern English rugby, went public. He said plainly that he too had been racially abused after games, that he'd received direct messages laced with hate, that he, despite everything he's achieved, still had to deal with being othered in a sport that loves to talk about values. Ellis Genge, another England international, spoke out too. He'd experienced racism in stadiums and online. He was clear. The abuse wasn't new. It just wasn't being talked about enough. And rugby, for all its branding about respect and tradition, had stayed quiet for too long. This moment shattered a myth that rugby was somehow above all this, that its culture, its etiquette, its post-match handshakes meant racism didn't exist here. The truth? It was just better hidden, less visible, more coded, but always there. Look deeper and it becomes clear. Representation in coaching, boardrooms and commentary booths is still overwhelmingly white. Media narratives often treat players of color differently. Tougher language for the same mistakes, less benefit of the doubt. Fans say things in the stands they'd never post online, and in grassroots rugby, black and brown players regularly speak about microaggressions and feeling like outsiders in what's still a very white space, especially in England. The abuse after Euro 2020 gave players across all sports, including rugby, a reason to finally break the silence. It wasn't just about one match, it was about years of being asked to be grateful, polite, and quiet in the face of daily racism. And this wasn't just a social issue, it was an institutional one. Governing bodies had no unified strategy to deal with it. Some players said they'd reported abuse and heard nothing back. Others spoke of media campaigns celebrating diversity one minute and ignoring racism the next. So when the RFU released statements condemning racism, many players and fans wanted more than words. They wanted change. Not just hashtags, not just anti-racism shirts before kickoff, structural change, investment in diverse coaching pipelines, proper handling of abuse cases, cultural awareness training. That wasn't just a box-ticking exercise. Rugby, like football, got exposed, and while the spotlight was shining on rugby's racial blind spots, another player was dying on the pitch, this time in 2015. The sudden death of Danny Jones. Danny Jones wasn't just a professional rugby league player. He was a husband, a father, and one of the most respected men in the sports community. On the 3rd of May, 2015, while playing for Keighley Cougars in a League One match against London Skolars, Danny collapsed just minutes after being substituted off the pitch. He had suffered a cardiac arrest. Emergency teams tried everything they could. He was flown by air ambulance to the hospital, but he didn't make it. He was only 29 years old. What made this tragedy so deeply unsettling wasn't just how sudden it was that Jones had passed a pre-match health check that very day. It was later revealed that he had an undiagnosed hereditary heart condition, something that hadn't shown up in routine screenings. His death sent a jolt through the rugby world, not just because of the man he was, but because of what it said about the systems in place to protect players. If someone like Danny, fit, young, and actively playing at a professional level, could collapse and die so suddenly, then how many others were unknowingly at risk? His wife, Lizzie Jones, didn't let his death fade into a headline. She turned her grief into action. She became a campaigner for cardiac screening in athletes and helped launch the Danny Jones Defibrillator Fund, which supplies life-saving equipment to community clubs. Thanks to her, awareness around heart conditions in sport has grown significantly. Danny's story isn't just a tragedy, it's a turning point. A reminder that health risks in rugby go beyond the bruises and concussions. They can be silent and lethal. And unless we keep pushing for better screening, better protection, and better education, more families will be left with nothing but unanswered questions. Rugby is a game of incredible passion, skill, and raw physicality. It's a sport that demands everything from its players: body, mind, and soul. But as we've seen, behind the glory and the roar of the crowd, there's a much darker side that often goes unseen. From heartbreaking tragedies like Kelly Miafua's suicide to the harsh realities of racism and exploitation, from medical scandals in top leagues to life-threatening moments like Quinton Van Wyck's cardiac arrest, these moments force us to confront the costs players pay just to entertain millions. Thank you for watching this video, and please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, as that would help us grow this channel. Thank you.